Combat is boring, or at least it often is in our modern literature world. Why is that? Hi, my name is Jonathan Oldenburg. I'm the author of Tears from Iron, the first book in a series titled Memories of the Cataclysm, which is now released on audiobook on Amazon. Check it out. So let's go back to combat. Why is it such a struggle these days to actually have something that should be exciting and intense be boring? I think the problem is that in this modern day and age, we grow up more with TV and movies than we do with books, or at least as much. And so those influences of what we see on the screen really get into our stories. And that makes sense. I mean, you see an awesome sword fight like between, Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader, and you're like, I want to write something awesome like that. And so what we try to do is we try to capture that visual medium on the written page. They say that pictures are worth 1,000 words. So trying to capture a moving picture, how many thousands of words does that take? And that's where we fall short. So what do I mean by this? Oftentimes our combat descriptions come up to, Bob draws his sword and tries to stab Fred. Fred parries it and ducks and tries to stab Bob, and Bob dodges, and we get this sequence back and forth of who's doing what with the swords and how they're parrying and dodging and what have you. And there's this give and take. It just gets boring. Sure, you can have all sorts of colorful metaphors and vivid adjectives, but ultimately what you're ending up with is window dressing for an empty room. The fight, the story has no soul, and that's why it gets dry. So what can we do about this? I think there are four major solutions. The first is simply acknowledging the fact that movies and books are different. One is a visual medium and the other is written. And they both have their strengths. We've kind of talked about the strengths of the visual medium already, but now let's talk about the books. And in this, we have something that I think many movie and TV producers, directors, and writers would really love to be able to do on that visual space, and that is get inside of our characters. Sure, they can try to show emotions on the face or say words or things like that, but they can't actually get in to see what the person is thinking, and that is what a book can do in just a few words, where a movie is going to be struggling for a long time to try to achieve that same level of depth. And so what is combat like for the person who's actually in the combat? Odds are they're angry or afraid. They're very focused. There's chaos. There's heat. I mean, battle is warm. It's hot. You're expending huge amounts of energy. There's pain. There's all these different kinds of things that a person is experiencing as part of being in combat. That is what we can put on the written page, and that is what can draw the reader in and make it exciting and something that they really want to follow and that they're really worried and in suspense about. So that's the first one. How about number two? In this one, I want to talk about scene and sequence. This is the writer's term that's commonly used. Scene is essentially a period of continuous action. Oftentimes it's dialogue, or it could be our combat where we're talking about, or a car chase, or something which is happening in a solid progression. Sequence are those bridges between scenes. So say, for example, we have a king who says, I want to go to war, call the council, let's have a discussion, they have a discussion. All that is a scene. Then when they march to war, we may have a chapter break, or in a movie we may see a dramatic sequence of soldiers marching. And then they actually get into the fight, and that's another scene where combat's taking place, right? So let's talk about that in an actual combat moment, whether it's a duel or a bunch of guys fighting another bunch of guys or what have you. I think that when we talk about scene and sequence in a battle, the sequence, ironically, is the fighting. It's the stuff which fills in between those moments that really matter, which is what the character is experiencing, how the character is growing, how the plot is progressing, what themes are being played out. Those happen between the sword thrusts, if you will, or between the charge and the counter charge of the cavalry. So if you think about that, the key moments in a battle is not actually the battle, it's those other things. Then that, I think, is what it will piece your story more solidly together. You have to have the cavalry charge, you have to have the sword thrust, certainly, but you don't spend huge amounts of time on each of them. You weave them into the scenes of dialogue or of feeling or of emotion that your protagonists or other characters are experiencing. So how about number three? The next tip is actually true for any kind of combat, whether it's in the books, in movies, and TV, anything. But I think it still is worth saying, and that is that combat just can't exist in a vacuum. It has to have something at stake. And that thing that's at stake usually cannot be the protagonist's life. Now, if you're writing a book with a huge cast of characters where there's not really one key protagonist, sure, you can off one or two of them or whatever, just to show you can. Personally, I don't care for that kind of story. I like characters that I actually can be drawn to and feel like I'm going to follow them through the narrative. And so if you keep on killing them off, I lose those connections and I lose interest in the story. But I know that's popular these days. So if you're writing that kind of a story, that works. But in general, let's assume that that's not what you're going for. Let's assume you actually have a protagonist or two that is the story. And so, particularly early on, you know that that character is not going to die. So there actually is no life or death jeopardy for that character because the story's about them, and if they die, then the story's over, and we have 500 more pages to go. So what can you do to create that suspense and that worry on the part of the reader if you can't have the risk of death? Every battle has to have a price that the reader expects may be exacted. And most of the time, it should be, or something else, maybe something worse. And that could be, losing a prized possession, losing a key position, losing control of something that's important to you, losing a friend, anything which is key to our care about the character, our care about the world, our care about the plot that may be lost is critical and needs to happen in these battles. And that leads into our final tip, which is to subvert the reader's expectations. And by subvert, I don't mean corrupt your promises to the reader. Every author makes what I call authorial promises, and you can Google and find those many different discussions on that. I've done some in my articles as well, and I'll probably do a video on that here in the future. But basically, every author makes subtle promises to the reader of what kind of story they're reading, what they can expect. And so if a reader is subtly providing cues that the hero ultimately is going to ride off into the sunset, and then they kill the hero off in the final scene, they have destroyed the reader promise. They have not delivered what they promised to deliver, and that's an ultimate betrayal, the worst thing an author can probably do to their reader other than maybe not finishing a series. And so we make those promises, and we need to keep them. So when I say subvert, I don't mean that kind of violation. What I mean is having that scene play out in a way that the reader did not expect, but in the bigger context, they realize, oh, that makes sense, and they're moved by it. I'll go back to the Star Wars analogy since it seems to work so well for some of this. So when Obi-Wan Kenobi gets killed by Darth Vader, we didn't see that coming, or at least probably we didn't. Maybe there's a few of us who did when we were watched that the first time. But we expected them all to get away. We knew that Obi-Wan Kenobi was up to some sort of shenanigans. But when he actually said, "Oh, go ahead and kill me," I didn't see that coming. And so that was a really moving moment where the story did something, it exacted a price like it should, but it was a price that we did not expect. But it was a price that also made sense and fit into the grander scheme of things and still fulfilled that authorial promise. So if you can find a way in your combat to have not only have a price, but to have a price with a rewarding kind of consequence, that's the best kind of combat you can have. And that will get your readers to pay attention, to be fully engaged throughout, and not just to flip to the end to see what happens. So I'd like to wrap up by looking at a few examples, drawing from some of those authors who were perhaps most influential on my own writing, and I think are wildly popular with good reason. The first of these, of course, has to be J.R.R. Tolkien. And so let's look at the Battle of Pelennor Fields. That's the penultimate battle in The Return of the King, where the Riders of Rohan come to the rescue of Minas Tirith, which has been heavily besieged by Sauron's forces. So if you think about it, that is the moment in the book, at least for me it is. It really captures when I think about The Return of the King, almost as much, perhaps even more, than Frodo and Sam at the Cracks of Doom. We have this battle. And the surprising thing is it's only 9 pages. That's less than 3% of the entire book. It's a tiny fraction of all that happens in the story. And so I think that's a first important point. The second part of that is that 6 of those pages is actually really what I called sequence according to my definitions above. It's the movement of armies, the vast sweep of the riders, the orcs turning to face the Grand, the battering ram striking the gates of the city, things like that. And so none of those are really zoomed in on any particular moment of action or any particular characters. It's only 3 pages that are devoted to that scene which captures all of our attentions, I assume, Éowyn, Merry, and the Witch King of Angmar. And that's where the battle happens. 3 pages, uh, less than 1% of the entire story. So what happens on those 3 pages? Why are we drawn forward into that action, into that suspense, into that moment? The risk of failure is that the Witch King survives, he rallies his forces, Mount Doom prevails, Minas Tirith falls, and it's all for naught. We know that that probably isn't going to happen because Tolkien has made various authorial promises to us that he's telling a positive story with good things in the end. So even though we may worry about that in the grand scheme of things, we realize in the big picture that that's not going to happen. In some way, there's going to be a form of triumph. So that risk isn't really the big risk. The really big risk is actually the price that's paid, and that is the loss of King Theoden, and then the severe wounding and almost death of Éowyn and Merry. Also, I mentioned subversion of expectations, and the expectation here that's changed is Merry. That's where the magic happens, because when we look at the prophecy, no man shall destroy me, we're all thinking Éowyn. Éowyn's not a woman. Tolkien builds up this expectation that Éowyn's the one who's going to break the prophecy, and she doesn't. It's Merry. It's Merry stabbing him in the foot, which allows Éowyn then to be that awesome hero she is and kill the Witch King of Angmar. And so that's where the expectation is arrived at for the reader, but in a surprising way that really fulfills the moment and builds that suspense, that drawing into the combat and caring about what happens. So for our second author, we're going to look at Robert Jordan. His books in his series got really long, I confess, but he really knew how to write combat scenes. And so I've picked 2 of them. One is a duel and one is the battle. The first, the duel, is in his second book, The Great Hunt, and that's where Rand al'Thor is fighting Lord Turok, the leader of the Sanshon invasion. I think I pronounced that name correctly. And so in that moment, we have actually a bunch of different things happening. There is, of course, the risk of Rand al'Thor's death. Yeah, not likely going to happen. He's the dragon reborn. He is the whole point of the story. If he dies, then the story dies. So even though that is the theoretical risk, that's not really the big risk. The real linchpin is actually the prophecy before the battle of 5 will ride forth. We know that one of the people we've been following, we've been caring about, is going to die. We don't know who it is. Pretty confident it's not going to be Rand. Doubtful it'll be Matt or Perrin. But we've got to know all 5 of these characters, and we care about them. So it's very meaningful for us that one of them is going to die, and we worry about who that is. And so we are gripped at the edge of our seats, waiting to see who is going to be paying that ultimate price. But there's more to it than that. I don't know that there's a surprise in this one like there was in Lord of the Rings. It's been a few years since I've read Robert Jordan. So if you know, maybe you can call that to mind. But the other part which makes this scene so important is this is Rand's first kill. This is the first time he actually is taking a life. All through the first book, all through the portions of the second book, the greater part of the second book that's played out so far, he has not actually killed anyone. And now he is fighting somebody to the death. And so that has a huge character arc and plot arc and theme arc impact, which drives, really, frankly, the next story. So that one moment is really important for the reader and grips them and pulls them forward. The second combat scene I want to call from Robert Jordan is actually from his 6th book, The Lord of Chaos, and it may be my favorite battle scene ever, and that is the Battle of Dumai's Wells, where Rand is in the box being carried off to Tar Valon, and all of his friends are coming to rescue him. I confess, it's been so long since I've read it that I can't call to mind the real risk. I suppose there might be some real risk to Min, who's captured with him. There might be some real risk to Robert Jordan does sometimes like to prolong things, and so there's a real risk that maybe Rand actually does make it to the tower and the whole thing fails. But the actual price isn't actually in the battle itself, although there are some character moments which are key for what's going forward. But the actual that great price is what has happened at home or in his realm, where things have begun to fall apart, and he has to then deal with that. My final example is from a childhood author who, frankly, I find to be as readable as an adult now as when I was a kid, but he wrote fantastic combat scenes as well, and that is Lloyd Alexander, in particular his Prydain series, and we'll be looking at the big battle of Caer Dathyl in the High King. And in that battle, it's all the forces of good against the forces of evil, and everything's playing out, and so there's all sorts of things nominally at stake, and there are a bunch of surprises. There's the betrayal, which completely changes the moment. But what really moves me in this one, and I recommend you take a look at it. The battle's really short; it's only 5 pages, even shorter than Tolkien's, and this is 5 pages of child font, so it's a fraction. But once again, it feels like it takes up so much more of the story because it has such a presence. And that presence is because as Taran is fighting, he is experiencing all of these emotions and these feelings and um, these impressions that really a movie cannot capture. It's that golden sweet spot of books. Also, this is a perfect example of the greatest risk of all, and that is failure. They lose. Maybe have not seen that coming, but it actually happens. And so that opens up the whole rest of the story where they have to deal with the crisis of that failure and what do we do now. So those are 4 examples. Hopefully those were helpful for you as kind of piecing together the things I talked about. And hopefully this has been good advice. If you're a reader, hopefully I didn't ruin all of those combat scenes for you that are written poorly too much, and maybe you can capture some of the moments and appreciate on a deeper level what authors are doing who are doing it really well. And as an author, hopefully that gave you some advice on how you can make your combat far more engaging, and really live up to the expectation of your readers. Thanks. Have a good day.